Everybody, I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my studio here. We're experimenting with some new equipment, and you'll see me from an angle you're probably not used to seeing me from. This is the um, actual camera on our new MacBook. And so we did buy a new MacBook in order to try to bring more cameras and things into the production eventually, but it takes a little while to learn how to work all these things. Meanwhile, I've got a great camera on this MacBook, so you see a wider angle than you usually do, and perhaps that's maybe refreshing. Who knows? Let me know what you think about the video in the comments there, and welcome. I'm sorry I was a little late this morning. Putting together, I think, is going to be a very interesting show, so let me go ahead and get started. I want to introduce to you this book called Defeating Slavery, Hamilton's American System Showed the Way, by Nancy Braden Spannaus. And Nancy Spannaus has been writing for many, many years on these type of topics. And she has association with a lot of the LaRouche people. I don't think there are actually associated at this time, but I don't know. But this is where I got her from, was references to her work in the LaRouche materials. Now, there have been a number of books that I've read on my show which are of a similar theme. This is the book that I read right here, How the Nation Was Won, by H. Graham Lowry, and you can see that on McDuff Archive on my Rumble channel, called McDuff Archive. This is a book that I think gets us fairly far into understanding the real circumstances in which the American Revolution happened. The America's Untold Story, Volume 1, 1630 to 1754. Unfortunately, there is no Volume 2. But I do believe other people have taken up the torch, including our good friend Tony Chaikin, in which this book also fits in with the same theme, and that is this book by Anton Chaikin, Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1, 1750s to 1850s. And from talking to Tony, I know he is working hard on Volume 2. But this gets us up to the 1850s. And why these books are important is because they tell the story not from the Rockefeller history conglomerate. When they took over medicine, they also took over history. They took over education, and they took over the way that children are taught history in school. Now, of course, being all consolidated under Department of Education, other guidelines that force teachers to teach to the test, and the test is going to ask questions consistent with the narrative that they have created for us to try to believe in. I don't believe it, but that's because I've been studying it for a long time. I first got interested in history in high school, didn't learn much, went to college at College of William and Mary, where I learned a lot, and majored in government, took some history courses, but mainly was interested in the philosophy of government. And then, of course, after that, then I studied law at Georgetown. I have a JD, Doctorate of Laws degree, and that sent me into the work world, where I spent the next 25 years until I realized that I really didn't like it. I wasn't making any money at it, and I think I kind of got sort of shadow banned. Coming out of Georgetown, you'd think you'd get recruited, but I never did. And I think that has to do with who my father was and who I am. And that's why I'm doing all this on my own, financing it myself, of course, with my wife's help. But this is an effort to show the alternate history is real and the narrative history is fake. So these books, I've glommed onto them and shared them with you in great detail because they do just that. They get rid of the negative gloss that we get from the Rockefeller history people and obscuring something that I think is very, very important. And that is, of course, the British / Zionist attack upon the American system. The American system, as we understand it, is the system that creates productivity in the United States. And as we look at this book, Defeating Slavery by Nancy Spannaus, which only published last week, and I'm one of the first people to get a copy, and I'm really delighted with it. I've only read through, I've skipped around a bit, but my actual reading has only gotten me through page 81. But let's look at it for a moment. The author's note over, oh, thank you. Cheers. Pardon me for the noise. I forgot to get my mute button there. All right. So the author's note, over the past 4 years, since I have published Hamilton versus Wall Street, I worked hard to establish Alexander Hamilton's identity as the founder of the American system of economics, which he capitalizes, which built the industrial strength and prosperity of the United States. For a self-published volume with no company or organization behind it, the book has done relatively well, having sold approximately 1,600 copies and gained a certain currency in pro-Hamilton circles. Now, this is at a time in which Hamilton has been drawn into the narrative through a very highly financed, produced, and publicized musical play called Hamilton, which you're probably familiar with. I did not see it. I guess I didn't want to get my mind screwed up with whatever nonsense they put on stage. So I've been trying to stick to things like these books that, only 1,600 people got a copy of that book. But if it was me, I would say this should be in every high school. So if you put this book in the high school curriculum, then you'd get an incredible change in the way that American children appreciate their country. Hamilton designs a system of economics that essentially does defeat slavery. And that's the theme of the book that Nancy Spannaus has shared with us. And we go through all the evidence of how the various colonies had anti-slavery movements going back in time into the 1600s, but not dying out. When the Revolution came along, the great leaders of Massachusetts were all anti-slavery. So now we have been faced by this narrative, which comes most recently in something called the 1619 Project. And according to Nancy Spannaus, the 1619 Project is an effort to tie the United States to slavery, to say that the United States was not a free country except for the fact that it had slaves, and the slavery itself was where we got our wealth from. But that's the opposite from true. But think, if you are sitting in Chatham House considering how you're going to screw the next generation of Americans, you might want to falsify their history, make them think that America was founded on slavery, which it very much was not. And so this book is a great way to introduce it. It's well written. It's easy to read. I'll read a little bit from chapter 1. Slavery in the European colonial period. After all, didn't America invent slavery? Read the mocking title of a Forbes magazine article on August the 30th, 2019. In the wake of the New York Times August 18th publication of its 1619 blockbuster, a mere 2 weeks before, with its assertions that America's story began with slavery, it unfortunately seemed like a reasonable question to many at the time. Of course, serious scholars on the subject of slavery in America and elsewhere have long taken a different approach. At a lecture on the global impact of the slave trade, which I attended in Leesburg, Virginia in 2018, John Franklin, senior manager of external affairs at the Museum of African American History in Washington, began his talk by showing a series of world maps of the slave trade from Africa, which would stun most Americans today. Less than 5% of the 12.5 million slaves estimated to have been transported across the Atlantic between 1501 and 1867, Franklin explained, came to the North American continent. As far as I know, it's impossible to tell how many people were enslaved on the planet during the period in which North American colonies were founded. Slavery was rampant in Africa, Asia, and South America, undoubtedly running into the many millions, according to the award-winning author David Hackett Fisher. The Atlantic slave trade was less than half of that toward the east. In other words, the slaves are going into Asia, into the east from Britain, instead of going into the United States or the colonies. So the vast amount of slavery was not in the United States, was not in the colonies, and was certainly not a large percentage of the imports that were coming in. I also have a large volume by a man named Hugh Thomas, which gives a history of the slave trade, which basically underlines and emphasizes exactly that point, that so many of the African people that were enslaved were sent to Brazil by the Portuguese or the Spanish. And the amount of them that ended up in America is significant, of course, but it's not like America invented the slave trade. That is the false narrative. I was watching a history presentation yesterday on the CSS Alabama. The Commerce Raider, that was the ship that was captained by Raphael Sims. Raphael Sims, born here in Charles County, where I live, not too far away, maybe 25, 30 miles away from this spot. But he was a strong believer in the superiority of the white race, took his family to Alabama, to Mobile, Alabama, and it was there that he became the great commerce raider for the Confederate States. So commerce raiding had the result of reducing the American commercial fleet to practically zero. First of all, the ones that got sunk, but secondly, the ones that heard about the guys getting sunk, they just reflagged their vessels. They said, no, we're not going to be American vessels if we're going to get sunk by the Alabama. So the big result of it was that what trade we had, transoceanic trade we had, was deferred over to Great Britain. Great Britain, of course, rules the waves and always wants to. So we might think of Sims as one of the great agents of Make America Great Britain again. He might as well have been paid by the British Treasury for the things that he did, benefited the British and not the Americans. In looking at the beginnings of the anti-slavery in Nancy Spannaus's book, one of the things that came up conflicted a lot with what this lady said on the Alabama. She was a British lady with a academic degrees and an approach of I'm telling you the history, but what I think she's really doing is telling the narrative history that she believes in because of her own education. And what she said was that by 1830, when slavery was finally supposedly eliminated in the British Empire, that the British people didn't like slavery at all. They were all completely against it. The idea that they would hold slaves is ridiculous. It's an antiquated thing to them, and they don't know anything of any reason why anybody would want to hold slaves. However, let's read this from Nancy Spannaus about the special case of India. The picture of slavery globally during the 17th and 18th century is enhanced by looking at the situation in India, a major center of enslavement that was dominated by the British Empire. Portuguese, Dutch, and British merchant companies all had a foothold in that country, exploiting it for spices, dyes, textiles, and other goods valued in Europe. Through the course of the trade, millions of Indians were reduced to outright or de facto slavery. Some of that slavery was administered through middlemen, Muslim potentates who alternatively fought and collaborated with the British once the government took over in its own right in 1857. The British taking over the British East India Company is what that refers to. The tradition of slaveholding was widespread in Muslim territories historically, despite the Quran's frequent promotion of manumission, and thus entrenched in India prior to the arrival of the British. But slavery was also directly administered through the Dutch and British East India Companies, right? The Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, which exported tens of thousands of enslaved Indians out of India, as well as using them for labor in the country. Publications by British missionaries estimate that more than 1 million Indian slaves were held by British occupiers as late as the 1830s. The importance of the trade to the British is seen by the fact that when the empire officially banned slavery in 1833, it made a special exception for British East India Company territories. Officially, slavery in India was to end in 1843, but the British rulers did not declare it a criminal offense to hold a slave until 1861. While India first came under European colonial domination under the Portuguese and the Dutch, the British East India Company gradually gained ascendancy during the 18th century. The word company does not convey the operation of this merchant operation, however. It was a full-throated military expeditionary force, granted powers of governance over major areas of the country. As such, its soldiers were able to force compliance with their demands to provide the company with the goods it wanted at the price it wanted. This was particularly true with textiles. Throughout the 18th century, British economic policies succeeded in devastating the Indian textile industry, for example, which had been a thriving enterprise up to the time. In the 17th century, India was manufacturing 25% of the world's textiles. Through enforcing, including militarily, exclusive contracts and carrying out discriminatory trade war, the East India Company ruined the local producers. They would fix prices for goods too low for Indian spinners to make a living, and then set tariffs as high as 85% for exports into the British market. It is impossible to know how many Indians or imported Africans were enslaved by Dutch, British, or other colonial empires in the 17th and 18th centuries, but a reasonable estimate would put the number in the range of 10 million or more. Yes, slavery was indeed a global atrocity in the colonial era. The stories of the colonies individually are then recounted in separate chapters. I really recommend this book to you. I think, not only does it summarize a lot of the good stuff that we've learned from Graham Lowry and Tony Chaikin so far, but it puts a very sharp focus on slavery and the difference between the American system and the slave system is that in the American system, people recognize that slavery is not only evil, but counterproductive, because people who enslave other people become indolent themselves. They don't use their brains to invent, they don't use their bodies to work, they don't develop new ways of doing things or thinking. They simply consume and enjoy and exploit. And by believing that somehow they belong to a master race, they can justify it all. Nevertheless, most of the writers that Nancy Spannaus quotes in here recognize that we're all the same, that the matter of skin color should not make a bit of difference. The colony of Georgia is a tragic example of what happened. This very anti-slave guy named James Edward Oglethorpe founded Georgia. He named it after George II, of course, just to get the king's name associated with what he's doing. He passed laws that there would be no slaves, no slavery, no slave trade, no use of slaves in the colony of Georgia. And these laws were approved by Parliament. But the problem was right next to him was the colony of South Carolina on the north and the Spanish colony of Florida on the south, both of which allowed and thrived on the slave trade. So Georgia gets gradually taken down and brought into the slave business by the South Carolinians. And that is the end of that. Why the American system is better is because the American system is based upon productivity. The American system has to fight against Great Britain because Great Britain passed a law that said you can't build anything out of iron. The only thing you can do with iron is to convert it into usable iron bars and then ship it out to Great Britain where they can use it. But you can't build things. You're not allowed to create manufacturing centers in the colonies. Why? Because Britain's idea is to exploit the colonies, not to allow them to become independent and grow their own productive economies. And so that's it. As long as we are treated as colonies from which we and our abundant resources are simply getting raped, then it facilitates that we should have ourselves slaves, so that you become overseers of a vast number of slaves that are generating tobacco and then later cotton for the use and exploitation of the elites in Great Britain. Now, what does this have to do with the other studies that I'm doing? For instance, our Mindfields of about 2 months ago, in which I looked into the Jewish financiers coming into New Orleans and the spread of merchant enterprises with financing through these Rothschild and other, Montefiore, the Mocatas, and the other elite Jewish financier companies or families, really, from Europe that are facilitating this slave trade. And that's another thing that you'll notice, is that the Jewish financiers are financing and facilitating the slave trade itself. So I'm going to turn to one of my favorite writers, not saying I agree with everything he says, but this, of course, is David Livingstone, whose book called Ordo ab Chao is online at ordoabko.ca. He is a Canadian, so you'll find that at .ca. And now I'm going to read a section of his book called Dixieland. It's from volume 2, and it's about the financing of the Civil War, etc. So this is David Livingstone, Ordo ab Chao, Dixieland. The Curse of Ham, the controversial rabbinical interpretation of the Bible, note he says rabbinical, became the basis for the subjugation of the African slaves, ultimately creating an ideological divide that resulted in the American Civil War of 1861 and persists to this day, serving as the basis for the Southern strategy. That means Nixon's Southern strategy, the conversion of the Republican Party into a anti-Black party to fit with the voting proclivities of the Dixiecrats, who they decided to seduce into the Republican Party and generally were successful. So the Southern strategy. The Curse of Ham also received the support of Freemasonry when it served to justify the exclusion of Blacks. See, Freemasonry is still racist in terms of looking at the color of the skin of the people in various lodges. It's obvious. The first justification was articulated in Anderson's Constitutions, that is, Masonic Constitutions of 1923, where he outlined the legends of Freemasonry as well as its regulations or charges, including the ancient landmarks. Among these landmarks was the requirement that a candidate for Freemasonry must be, quote, good and true men, free-born, and of mature and discreet age, no bondmen, no women, no immoral or scandalous men, but of good report, unquote. Quoting further, no doubt Adam taught his sons geometry and the use of it in the several arts and crafts convenient at least for those early times. For Cain, we find, built a city, which he called consecrated or dedicated after the name of his eldest son, Enoch, and became the prince of the one half of mankind. His posterity would imitate his royal example in approving both the noble science and the useful art. Noah and his 3 sons, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, all masons true, brought with them over the flood the traditions and arts of the antediluvians and the people who lived before the flood, that is, and simply communicated them to their growing offspring. However, as noted by Michael Homer, Lawrence Dermot, the first Grand Secretary of the rival Grand Lodge of Ancients, organized in London in 1751, who took a design by Rabbi Leon Templo as the basis for its coat of arms, published Ahiman Rezo, a history which provided one of the foundations upon which some American Masons could rationalize that Ham's descendants, who they believed were Black, were ineligible to join the lodges. According to Dermot, quote, it is certain that Freemasonry has existed from the creation, though probably not under that name, that it was a divine gift from God, that Cain and the builders of his city were strangers in the secret mystery of Masonry, that there were but 4 Masons in the world when the deluge happened, that one of the 4, even the second son of Noah, was not a master of the art. In antebellum America, according to David Goldenberg, the Curse of Ham, quote, was the single greatest justification for maintaining Black slavery and for keeping that social order in place for centuries. Pre-Civil War Americans regarded Southerners as a distinct people who possessed their own values and ways of life. During the 3 decades leading up to the Civil War, popular writers created a stereotype, now known as the plantation legend, that described the South as a land of aristocratic planters, Southern belles, and devoted household slaves. Hattie McDaniel. This image of the South as a land of cotton where old times are not forgotten was popularized in 1859 in a song called Dixie, written by a Northerner named Dan Emmett, probably the best known song to have come out of black-faced minstrelsy. Emmett adopted the tune for a pseudo-African-American spiritual in the 1870s or 80s. Blackface performers added their own verses or altered the song. In the United States, now here's where we get into the big picture politics. Giuseppe Mazzini, and you've heard of him, right? He's the leader of Young Italy and Young This and Young That, the Masonic beginnings of the revolutions of 1848, etc. Spearheaded a plan in league with the Rothschilds to foment the Civil War along the divide of the volatile issue of race. Central to this plan, reports Hager, was the Rothschild family. The Mazzini-Rothschild conspiracy devolved from Southern Jewish community networked with secret societies of the Skull and Bones. This is what we see in tracing the history from Dope Inc. that we've read from extensively, this original volume by the EIR publication, the Executive Intelligence Review, to show that these two forces are working together, the Rothschilds and the British, the secret societies. The Mazzini-Rothschild conspiracy devolved from Southern Jewish community networked with secret societies of the Skull and Bones, the Knights of the Golden Circle, and the Ku Klux Klan, who were inspired by the vigilantism of the Holy Vaim, V-E-H-M, who advanced the cause of slave ownership against the abolitionists of the North. The Supreme Council, ancient and accepted Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, commonly known as the Mother Supreme Council of the World, founded in Charleston in 1801, was headed by Albert Pike, who headed the super rite of Freemasonry known as the Palladian Rite with Mazzini. Despite having been defeated in the War of 1812 and having signed the Non-Aggression Treaty of 1814, Britain still longed to return America to its rule. As explained Nicholas Hager, quote, through the Scottish Rite Lodges of the English obedience in the North, it controlled northeastern wealth, but could not control the South, as Southern wealth was measured in slaves. And you can see this is true. The Southern people considered their slaves to be the same thing as a piece of real property that they could trade, mortgage, dispose of as they will. So the Southern wealth was measured in slaves. And that's a very difficult, important thing. You don't need currency if you've got slaves. You don't have to pay anybody. You just tell them to do it and they do it. So the whole idea of currency being essential is part of what Franklin was saying, part of what the reason that we had the revolution was because they wouldn't let us have our own currency. Another reason for the revolution. So instead of currency, they've got slaves. And that's how they measured their wealth. Continuing the quote, if Britain was to have economic control over the South, slavery would have to be, excuse me. Oh. Sorry. If Britain was to have economic control over the South, slavery would have to be abolished. And so a plan was devised to divide America over the slavery issue in the hope that America could be controlled economically and financially, if not militarily. The Rothschilds' funding, this is back to David Livingstone's text, the Rothschilds' funding of the North was conducted through Auguste Belmont. James Rothschild controlled the South via the Rothschild agent Judah P. Benjamin, a Southern lawyer and politician who came to be known as the Jewish Confederate. Benjamin was the most prominent Jewish plantation owner, having built Belchas Plantation in Plaquemines Parish, and owning 140 slaves. As observed by Feuerlicht, quote, whether so many Southern Jews would have achieved so high a level of social, political, economic, and intellectual status and recognition without the presence of the lowly and degraded slave is indeed dubious. How ironic that the distinctions bestowed upon Jewish men like Judah P. Benjamin were in some measure dependent upon the sufferings of the Negro slaves that they bought and sold with such equanimity. As indicated by Feuerlicht, despite all the abolitionist activities of Jews in the North, slavery had been implanted and nourished by Northern merchants, both Christian and Jewish. During the 18th century, Jews actively traded in slaves, and some running the slave markets. Therefore, as noted George Cohen, quote, it is hardly surprising that they became staunch upholders of the slavery system in their unwillingness to relinquish these personal benefits, unquote. The most dominant Jewish slave traders on the American continent included Isaac da Costa of Charleston, South Carolina in the 1750s, David Franks of Philadelphia in the 1760s, and Aaron Lopez of Newport in the late 1760s and early 1770s. Jacob Rader Marcus, a historian and Reform rabbi, wrote in his 4-volume History of American Jews that over 75% of Jewish families in Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia, owned slaves, and nearly 40% of Jewish households across the country did. As revealed in the Financial Times, Nathan Meyer Rothschild and James William Freshfield, founder of Freshfields, benefited financially from slavery, as records from the National Archives show, even though both have often been portrayed as opponents of slavery. On August 3, 1835, in the city of London, 2 years after the passing of the Slavery Abolition Act, Nathan Meyer Rothschild and his brother-in-law, Moses Montefiore, came to an agreement with the Chancellor of the Exchequer to issue one of the largest loans in history to finance the slave compensation package required by the 1833 Act. The two bankers agreed to loan the British government £15 million, with the government adding an additional £5 million later. The total sum represented 40% of the government's yearly income at the time, equivalent to some £300 billion today. It was the biggest bailout of an industry as a percentage of annual government expenditure, dwarfing the rescue of the banking sector in 2008. The money was not paid back by the British taxpayers until 2015. Remember, something similar happened in Ireland to our good friend Chris Fogarty, whose family grew up in the 1900s and through the 1950s. They were paying back money on a loan that was, again, similar situation where the British interests were bought out. A revolution in Ireland did not extinguish the British ability to continue owning and exploiting property in Ireland, and it continues to this day. In a similar way, after World War II, we have so many examples, and I've read some of them yesterday, of European corporate money extending, deals with the Nazis, but then after the war, extending deals with America and still being in business and still hanging on to its hidden capital. These are very similar outcomes and show a pattern of how the British handled it. Of course, in the American situation, there was no compensation to the owners of the slaves. That's why we had Jim Crow to try to actually de facto re-enslave the people. And if the U.S. government had bought out these slaveholders and made deals with them that they weren't going to harass Black people and stop influencing the government to divide and keep us divided by race, our country could have developed a lot faster in a much more healthy way, in my opinion. But that's what they did. They borrowed money against the British taxpayers, and the British taxpayers had to pay it off. The funds were not intended as reparations to the freed slaves to redress the injustices they suffered. Instead, the money went exclusively to the owners of slaves, who were being compensated for the loss of what had until then been considered their property. According to the Legacies of British Slave Ownership at the University College London, Rothschild himself was a successful claimant under the scheme as part of Antigua 390, where he was a beneficiary of as a mortgage holder to a plantation in Antigua, which had 158 slaves in his ownership. He received 2,571 pounds payment at the time, equivalent to $250,000 today. And the Rothschilds wanted to start a central bank in America. And the text here goes into Belmont and the interesting next section called Friends of the Blacks. We find a kind of a skeptical approach to all of this anti-slavery abolitionist speech that Nancy Spannaus cites so approvingly in her book. And again, I haven't read the whole book, so I'm just giving you my impressions of the first 4 or 5 chapters. The contrasting idea goes into the Illuminati. This again with David Livingstone's Ordo ab Chao. According to the Marquis de Luchet, the Illuminati, who excelled in proclaiming ideals that looked noble while secretly aiming at subversion, were behind the creation of a secret society to support the cause of abolitionism, called Amis des Noirs, the Friends of the Blacks, founded by Illuminatus Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a member of Bonneville's social club in England. Brissot had been invited by Thomas Clarkson to attend a meeting of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Clarkson had become convinced of the need to end the slave trade after writing a prize-winning essay, which I won't quote the name of. And Brissot founded his own abolitionist society in Paris in 1788. Assisting Brissot was Chevalier de Saint-Georges, a virtuoso musician, a black man known as the Black Mozart. Born in Guadeloupe, he was the son of Georges Saint-Georges, a wealthy married planter, and Anne dit Nanon, his 16-year-old Senegalese slave. Okay, the article goes on too long, but for me to quote it all. But let's say you've seen that picture on the Wedgwood picture where it has an enslaved black man with manacles and chains, kneeling and looking up at you and saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This comes from Wedgwood in the 1780s and is often shown as evidence of the British intention to eliminate slavery and anti-slave movement, which is real with the British people. So this is the big distinction. I'm not talking about the British people when I talk about the British finance system, which depends upon slavery, and I think it depends upon it and other immoral and anti-human things such as narcotics and other trade for its existence, for its survival. The medallion was designed by Josiah Wedgwood, who was active in the Lunar Society, where he became friends with Joseph Priestley and its founders Matthew Boulton and Erasmus Darwin, Freemason and father of Charles Darwin. Wedgwood was also a strong supporter of John Wilkes, a member of the Hellfire Club. Did you know that? I didn't know that. and a distant relative of Abraham Lincoln assassin John Wilkes Booth. Wedgwood sent copies of his medallions to Benjamin Franklin, then president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, who was convinced of its value in bringing attention to the cause. So here's where I need to wrap it up today, and that is this. If you dig into the financing of the Civil War, you'll find that both sides were financed by Rothschild interests. The James Rothschild and Judah Benjamin in the South, Auguste Belmont and his allies in the North. And of course, that is a classic case of divide and conquer. That was perpetrated upon us by the British Empire and its partnering with the Zionist finance arm of the Rothschilds, which is still a problem of huge proportions today when we consider how was it that Israel got the nuclear bomb? How is it that the Rockefellers get away with funding both sides in the World War II? How is it that the crimes pointed out by people like Charles Higham in his great book about business as usual being superior in interest to all the human tragedies of war? Trading with the Enemy is the name of that book, and I have read substantial parts of it on my show. So what I'm trying to give you a taste of here is the idea that, yes, there is an evil subversion of the American economy, the American dream, the American system, and Hamilton's work to create a country that would be, pardon me, truly free. And this book, Defeating Slavery, is a terrific, well-written summary of all of the work that has been done by many people, including, and she cites them generously, Anton Chaikin, Graham Lowry, others that have been working for their entire lives to unmask the narrative that tells us that we're bad, the narrative that tells us that it's us that are responsible for slavery, that we need to take down our icons of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, and all of the founding fathers were all evil because they used slavery to get rich. That narrative does not reflect the true history of why our country was founded. And it is my strong belief that if high school kids would just get this book and read it, things could turn around. People could understand that the revolution was real, that this country is the last best hope of mankind, and that the Constitution of the United States is a sacred instrument that should never be violated. So that's my hope. That's what I'm here for today, is to spread the word that there are good people. There is real history. It's not impossible to find it. And thanks to David Livingstone for his work at ordoabkeo.ca. And particular thanks to Nancy Spannaus for spending so much of her valuable time working on this problem and publishing this brand new book, which you can get on Amazon, just like I did. All right. Thanks, everybody. I think that's going to do it for today. And I will see you guys tomorrow.